It was a cold, dreary morning when the maternity center doors swung open, and there he was at James, standing in the cold, his hands clutching a box of my favorite chestnut cake, a stark contrast to the heavy document he handed me, the divorce agreement. My heart skipped a beat, but there was no trace of guilt on his face. He looked almost relieved. "Vivian's coming back from abroad," he said, his words as casual as if he were discussing the weather. I glanced down at the divorce agreement. The words slowly sinking in. It was everything I had hoped for. The company was his, and all the property, the houses, the bank accounts, and even our child, were mine. "Great," I whispered, my voice laced with an emotion I couldn't quite place. There was a hint of satisfaction, but also an overwhelming emptiness. I was getting everything I wanted, and yet, it felt hollow. I glanced up at him, pretending to be displeased as I furrowed my brow. "James, we built this company together. You really won. To just kick me out like this?" I asked, a sharp edge to my tone. Without missing a beat, he handed me a pen. "We built it for Vivian's dream. Apart from the company, I can give you everything else." His words stung, but I couldn't afford to show weakness. I took the pen from his hand, signing the agreement without hesitation. A part of me feared that he might regret it later, but I couldn't afford to show any more hesitation. I had played the role of a dutiful wife for years. It was time to put that chapter behind me. James raised an eyebrow at my lack of tears or a scene. "Aren't you going to cry? Don't you have any nostalgia for all those years together?" His voice softened, almost in mock sympathy. I glanced at the baby in my arms, feeling a twinge of sadness, but my face remained calm. I smiled faintly. "I wish you and Miss Vivian a long and happy life," I said, my voice steady. He didn't answer, and for the first time in years, the silence between us felt final. The car ride to the Civil Affairs Bureau was short, but the tension between us could have lasted a lifetime. When we arrived, I could feel a strange sense of closure wash over me as we handed in the divorce papers. When the certificate was handed to me, James' face lit up with a rare smile. "I need to go home and pack," he said. "I'll move out tonight." "Okay," I replied, my voice almost too calm. James turned to look at me, his eyes scanning my face. "You're acting different. What happened to the woman? Who would have begged me not to leave?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I smiled brightly. "You should hurry home and pack. Miss Vivian's flight should arrive tonight, right? Don't waste any time." I could feel his gaze on me, but I didn't look back. There was no longer any need to. The night was already deep when we finally returned home. I had expected to feel something: relief, bitterness, sadness, but there was nothing. I had left behind my past, my marriage, and everything. That came with it. James didn't seem to notice. Or perhaps he did, but he wasn't interested in acknowledging it. He drove in silence, his face absent and tired, his mind elsewhere, no doubt already thinking about Vivian. After all, he had made it clear just how much she meant to him, even more than the life we had shared. The only thing I had left was the child in my arms, and that was all that mattered now. When we walked inside, the house seemed emptier than usual. The lights flickered as if protesting the absence of the warmth that once filled this place. It had been years since I truly felt at home here. Years of pretending, of keeping up appearances, of convincing myself that I was happy, that everything was fine, that I could make this work. I set the baby down in the crib, watching as the little one drifted into a peaceful sleep. How was it possible that such a small person could feel like the only anchor in a sea of chaos? I had always dreamed of having a child, but never like this. Not in the midst of heartbreak. Not with the cold, hollow echo of James' words ringing in my ears. But I had made my decision. The life I wanted was one free from the shadow of James. Free from the guilt and the endless sacrifices I had made for a man who would never be mine in the way I wanted. And now, in the wake of our divorce, I would have everything. The houses. The cars. The money. Everything except for one thing. His heart. It was a heart that had always belonged to someone else. Vivian. The woman he had never truly let go of, even when I stood beside him, bearing his child, building a future together. Now, as I sat there, staring at the baby in the crib, I realized something. I didn't need his heart. I had my own, and that was N. Oof. James was still standing by the door, his hand resting on the frame as he observed the sleeping child. I knew he was trying to play the part of a good father, but I could see through it. He was already thinking about Vivian. His mind was a million miles away. "Have you thought of a name for the baby?" he asked, his voice soft but distant. I chuckled lightly, the sound bitter to my own ears. "Ethan," I said, meeting his eyes for the first time since we'd gotten home. "Ethan?" James frowned. "Ed," as if the name didn't sit well with him. "This is my child too, you know." I met his gaze without flinching. "It's our child, James. But the divorce agreement clearly states that the child belongs to me. You know that." His frown deepened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, guilt, perhaps, or regret. But it was fleeting. "You're right," he said, finally looking down at his phone, no longer meeting my eyes. "You're right. And I'll make sure to provide for him. I won't skimp on the child support." I didn't need his money. I had always been capable of taking care of myself. "No need," I replied firmly. "I can afford to raise him on my own. You'd better focus on your future, James. It's time for both of us to move on." James didn't say anything more. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door, already thinking about the steps he had to take to move out. There was no longer any love between us. There hadn't been for a long time. Not in the way it was supposed to be. Not in the way I had dreamed of when I first met him. But it didn't matter anymore. After he left, I wasted no time. I blocked his number. All of his contact information. I had no interest in staying in touch with him, and I certainly didn't want him to try to worm his way back into my life. I was done with him. And I knew that I would never let him back in, not after everything that had happened. I immediately put the 3 houses and the family home up for sale. I listed them for about 5% lower than the market value. I wasn't in the mood to haggle. I just wanted them gone, and quickly. Within days, I had found buyers for 2 of the houses. The money from the sale would be more than enough to cover any costs for the future. With the proceeds, I bought a new house in a school district, paying for it in full. I didn't want to deal with any debts or payments. The rest of the money went into a bank account, earning interest. I knew that one day, when the time was right, I would find an opportunity to make my comeback. But there was one thing I hadn't anticipated. A phone call. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something about it made my stomach churn. I answered hesitantly, my hand trembling slightly as I pressed the phone to my ear. "Is this Evelyn?" The voice on the other end asked, urgent and breathless. "This is Vivian." "Vivian." I didn't expect to hear from her. Not now, not after everything that had happened. Why are you calling me? I asked, my voice colder than I intended. There was a brief pause before Vivian's voice came through, shaky and desperate. James, he's had a car accident. My blood type doesn't match his, and the doctors are saying he needs a transfusion. Can you come? Can you donate blood? I froze, the words sinking in. James? In an accident? My mind whirled with confusion, disbelief, and a touch of anger. I had just signed the divorce papers not long ago, and now they were asking me to help him? After everything he had done to me? Are you kidding me? I replied, the venom in my voice unmistakable. James and I haven't been together for months. You're his wife now, aren't you? Why don't you call someone else? But Vivian's voice was full of desperation. I don't know anyone else. Please. I'm begging you, Evelyn. You're the only one who can help. I laughed bitterly, my heart hardening. Vivian, you've been abroad for years. You don't know anyone else? Don't you think it's a little late for you to call me now? The truth was, I didn't want to help. I didn't want to be involved in their mess any longer. I had an obligation to James, no matter what he had done in the past. I'm sorry, Vivian, I said firmly. I'm not the one you need. James isn't my problem anymore. With that, I hung up the phone, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. I didn't know if I was angry or just numb. It didn't matter. I had made my choice. And James was no longer a part of my life. As I sat in the silence of my new home, my thoughts drifted back to the past. To the life I had once dreamed of with James. It seemed so far away now, a different world entirely. I had done everything for him. I had given him my love, my trust, my time. And in return, he had given me nothing but lies. But now, it was over. And I was free. The night passed in a blur. The house that once felt like home now felt like an empty shell. The baby's soft breathing was the only that brought me comfort. I couldn't sleep, though. The decision I had made today felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw James, his cold eyes, the mask of indifference he wore so effortlessly. He had walked away without a second thought, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I thought I had built with him. But as much as it hurt, I knew it was the right decision. I couldn't go on pretending. James had never been the man I thought he was. I spent the next few days immersed in routine, feeding the baby, managing the house, and checking on the sale of the properties. Each day felt like a small victory, a step further from the life I had left behind. But even in my efforts to move on, I couldn't escape the occasional thought of Vivian and James. Their names haunted me like a ghost, lingering in the background, reminding me of what I had lost. Despite myself, I found myself looking up at the sky one evening, wondering what James was doing. Was he with Vivian? Was he already planning their future together? The thought made my stomach churn. I didn't want to care. I didn't want to think about him anymore. But how could I not? He had been my life for so many years. It was during one of these moments of weakness that the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Vivian. It was an unknown number. My heart raced as I hesitated before answering. Hello? I asked, my voice tight with uncertainty. Is this Evelyn? A woman's voice came through the phone, sharp and clear. Yes, I said slowly, my mind racing. I'm Sophie, James's assistant. He's in the hospital. He needs you, the voice said, urgency creeping in. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. What happened? I asked, my mind instantly jumping to the worst possible conclusion. Sophie's voice cracked. He's been in an accident. It's bad, Evelyn. The doctors are saying he's in critical condition. He's asking for you. Please, he's asking for you. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. James. Injured. Critical. Asking for me. The man who had left me without a second thought was now asking for my help. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to tell Sophie that I didn't care. But another part of me, the part one had buried deep inside, couldn't ignore his plea. Despite everything, I knew that I couldn't turn my back on him, not now, not when he was asking for me. Which hospital? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Sophie gave me the details, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of the hospital. My hands shook as I gripped the door handle of the car. This wasn't supposed to happen. James wasn't supposed to need me anymore. As I walked through the sterile halls of the hospital, each step felt heavier than the last. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. Why was he asking for me? Was this some sort of trick? Was he trying to manipulate me to coming back? But when I reached his room, all of my doubts were silenced. James lay in the bed, pale and fragile, his body hooked up to machines. His face was swollen, bruised, and unrecognizable in some ways. Yet, I could still see the faint trace of the man I had once loved, the man who had once promised me the world. I stood at the door for a moment, frozen, unsure of what to do. He hadn't seen me yet. I could still turn around and walk away. But the memory of his voice, asking for me, kept me rooted to the spot. James, I said softly, my voice catching in my throat. His eyes fluttered open, and he blinked at me, confusion clouding his gaze. Then, as recognition dawned on him, a small, pained smile tugged at his lips. Evelyn. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, fightin'. Gee, the tears that threatened to fall. What happened to you? I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay composed. He tried to sit up, wincing in pain, but I gently pushed him back down. Don't try to move. Just rest. James nodded weakly. I didn't expect you to come, he said, his eyes full of regret. I didn't think you'd care. I looked at him for a long moment, my mind swirling with emotions I couldn't fully understand. Why did you call me, James? After everything. Gee, after what you did. My voice cracked as I spoke. You left me. You chose Vivian. Why are you asking for me now? James's eyes filled with guilt. I know I messed up, Evelyn. I know I hurt you. But I never stopped loving you. I never stopped needing you. I felt a pang in my chest at his words, but I quickly masked it with a cold expression. It's too late for that, James, I said, my voice hardening. You made your choices. And now, I'm making mine. He reached out weakly, his hand trembling. Gee, as he tried to grasp mine. Please, Evelyn, don't leave me like this. I need you. I pulled my hand back, my heart aching, but my resolve stronger than ever. You need me now? Where were you when I needed you? When I was in the delivery room, alone? When I was raising our child alone? Where were you then, James? He didn't have an answer. His head dropped back onto the pillow, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of our past hanging heavy in the air. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, the words barely audible. I didn't know what I had until I lost it. I wanted to scream, to tell him that his apology meant nothing. But instead, I stood up and took a deep breath. "I can't do this, James," I said quietly. "I can't be your second choice anymore. I won't be your safety net. Not now, not ever." I turned to leave, but just before I stepped out of the room, I heard him call my name one last time. "Evelyn, please, don't leave me." But I didn't turn back. I couldn't. He had already left me once, and I had learned the hard way that you can't rely on someone who's already abandoned you. I left the hospital without a second glance at James, but his words echoed in my mind, haunting me like a shadow that wouldn't let go. I thought I had moved on. I thought I was strong enough to walk away and ever look back. But standing there in that sterile hospital room, seeing him so vulnerable and broken, something inside me cracked. I had promised myself that I would never let him back into my life, but his apology, his desperation, stirred something deep within me. For a moment, I almost turned around, almost reached out to him. But then I remembered the years of neglect, the lies, the cold indifference he had shown me and our child. He had never cared enough to be there when I needed him the most. Why should I care now? I pushed the thought aside as I stepped out of the hospital and into the cool night air. The world outside seemed so calm, so detached from the storm I was navigating inside. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, I was living a completely different life, one where I had a husband, a future, a family. Now, I was standing on the edge of a new life, uncertain but determined. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I had a plan, a new beginning, and I wouldn't let anyone, least of all James, distract me from it. I had a child to raise, a career to build, and a future to create. I wasn't going to let the past weigh me down any longer. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. I moved into my new home, one that was far away from the memories of James and everything that had come with him. It was a fresh start, a place where I could build something of my own. The baby adjusted well to the change, and I poured all my energy into being the best mother I could be. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the shadow of my past. James's calls became more frequent, though I ignored them all. I blocked his number, deleted his messages, and tried to move forward without him. But there was something about his voice, something that lingered long after the phone call ended, that made it hard to completely shut him out. Vivian, too, seemed determined to keep her place in my life. She would call occasionally, asking for favors or updates on the company, pretending as if we were still friends. But every time I heard her voice, I couldn't help but feel a sense of bitterness. She had stolen my husband, and now she was trying to steal everything else. I couldn't let her have it all. One afternoon, I sat in my new living room, scrolling through emails and preparing for the next steps in my career, when my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it made me pause. I answered on the second ring, my heart racing as I pressed the phone to my ear. "Evelyn," a familiar voice said, "It's Sophie. I'm calling about the company. We're in trouble." I stiffened. "What do you mean? What's happening?" Sophie's voice sounded strained. "Vivian's been making decisions without consulting anyone. The company's hemorrhaging money, and we're running out of time. James can't help, and we don't know what to do." My mind whirled. I had walked away from Vivian Media, left it all behind. It wasn't my problem anymore. But the more Sophie spoke, the more I realized that my involvement was inevitable. "What do you need from me?" I asked, my voice calm despite the storm brewing inside me. "We need you to come back," Sophie said. "We need you to take control. Vivian doesn't know what she's doing. She's been making reckless decisions, and the artists are leaving. We're losing everything, Evelyn. You're the only one who can fix this." I felt the weight of her words settle in my chest. Everything I had built, everything I had worked for, was falling apart. And somehow, Vivian had managed to drag me back into the mess. I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want to go back to that toxic world where James and Vivian ruled everything. But I couldn't just walk away. I couldn't let everything I had worked so hard for crumble to dust. "Fine," I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "I'll come back. But this is the last time, Sophie. I'm doing this for the company, not for James or Vivian. Don't get that twisted." The next day, I found myself back at the office, standing in front of the familiar building that once felt like home. It hadn't changed, but everything about it felt different now. The walls no longer held the same promise of success and growth. Now, they felt suffocating, a reminder of everything I had lost. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The employees looked at me with a mix of relief and anxiety. They didn't know what to expect from me. Would I be the same person I was when I ran the company? Or had I changed beyond recognition? I didn't give them time to wonder. I walked straight into the conference room, where Sophie and a few key people were waiting for me. They all stood as I entered, their faces a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Evelyn," Sophie said, her voice shaky, "thank you for coming. We really need you right now." I nodded curtly, taking my seat at the head of the table. "Let's get down to business. What exactly is going on with the company?" Sophie slid a stack of papers in front of me, and I immediately started scanning through the financial reports. The numbers were a mess: unpaid bills, overdue salaries, and a long list of failed investments. It was clear that Vivian had no idea how to manage the company. "Where's Vivian?" I asked, my voice icy. "She's out of the country, on of the employees replied. "She's been handling things from afar, but it's clear she hasn't been paying attention to the day-to-day operations." I sighed, my fingers running through my hair in frustration. I should have known she couldn't handle it. This company was my dream, not hers. I built it from the ground up. And now I have to fix it. As I sat there, surrounded by the remnants of the company I once loved, I realized something. This wasn't just about saving the business. It was about proving to myself that I could rise above everything James and Vivian had taken from me. They might have stolen my marriage, my family, and my future, but they couldn't take away my strength. I was stronger than I had ever been. And this time, I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for me. The first few days after returning to the company were a whirlwind. As I walked through the familiar halls of Vivian Media, I could almost hear the echoes of the past, echoes of laughter, of ambition, of late nights spent with James as we built something from nothing. But now, those memories felt distant, like ghosts haunting the very walls that once held our dreams. The employees were cautiously optimistic about my return, but I could see the tension in their eyes. They didn't what to expect from me. Would I be the same Evelyn who had once managed everything with grace and determination? Or had I changed, hardened by the betrayal and pain that had become my life. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. My mind was focused on one thing: fixing the mess that Vivian had made of the company. The financials were a disaster, and the artists were starting to leave. Even worse, the investors were growing impatient, and rumors of the company's impending collapse were spreading like wildfire. Sophie, the assistant who had called me, was the only one who seemed to truly believe that I could turn things around. She met with me every day, presenting me with new data, reports, and updates on the state of the business. Her devotion to the company was admirable, but it also made me question why she had stayed so loyal to Vivian when she had been so clearly incompetent. How did it get this bad? I asked Sophie one morning, looking over yet another financial report. Vivian had no clue what she was doing, did she? Sophie hesitated before answering. She tried, Evelyn. But I think she was too focused on James. Everything she did was for him. And when things got tough, she just ran away. I frowned. So she ran away from the company too? Is that what you're telling me? Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of frustration and disbelief. She didn't care about the company the way you did. You built this, Evelyn. She just wanted the fame, the spotlight. She never understood what it took to make this business work. Her words stung, but I couldn't deny the truth in them. I had spent years building this company from the ground up, pouring my heart and soul into it. And now, I was faced with the task of picking up the pieces, again. Only this time, I was doing it without James by my side. And that, in a strange way, felt freeing. The first major decision I made was to call an emergency board meeting. I needed to take control. I had to show the team that I was in charge, that I wasn't the same woman who had walked away from this life. When the meeting began, the room was filled with nervous energy. The employees exchanged looks, unsure of what was to come. I could see the fear in their eyes, the fear of losing their jobs, of seeing the company crumble around them. But I couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. I know things have been rough, I began, my voice steady but firm. And I know that many of you have doubts about whether or not this company can be saved. But I'm here to tell you that we're not done yet. I paused, letting my words sink in. The room was silent, the tension palpable. I built this company from the ground up, I continued, my gaze sweeping over the room. And I'm not going to let it fall because of some mistakes made by people who didn't understand what it took to make it work. We are going to rebuild. We are going to fight. And we are going to succeed. The room remained silent, but I could see the shift in their expressions. The fear was still there, but now there was something else, hope. A glimmer of belief that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't been abandoned after all. I spent the next few days working tirelessly with the team, going over every detail, every contract, every financial report. There was no time to waste. I had to make bold moves if I wanted to save the company from collapse. The first thing I did was cut unnecessary expenses. The lavish parties, the extravagant office perks, gone. I had no time for frills. It was time to get back to the basics. We needed to focus on the artists, on creating the kind of content that would attract investors, not just the kind of content that would win popularity contests. Next, I reached out to the artists who were still with us, assuring them that the company was going to be revamped. I promised them that I would fight to keep their projects alive, that I would give them the resources they needed to succeed. The artists were a reflection of the company, and if they thrived, the company would thrive as well. One by one, the artists began to trust me again. They could see that I was different from Vivian, that I was actually working to rebuild, not just to exploit their talent for personal gain. Slowly, the tides began to turn. But there was still one more thing I needed to address: the investors. They were the lifeblood of the company, and if I didn't win their trust, everything I had worked for would be in vain. I arranged a meeting with them, presenting a new business plan that would restore confidence in the company's future. It was bold, risky, but it was the only option I had. I couldn't afford to fail. The meeting was tense, the room filled with the cold, calculating stares of the investors. They had heard all the promises before, and now they were waiting to see if I could deliver. As I presented the new plan, I could feel the weight of their scrutiny. But I didn't falter. I knew that if I didn't convince them, all the work I had done up until that point would be for nothing. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the investors nodded, their expressions softening. One by one, they agreed to the new terms, the relief in their eyes palpable. We had done it. We were back on track. But even as I celebrated the success of the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. There was a hole in my heart that no amount of success could fill. I didn't want to admit it, but I missed James. The days following the meeting with the investors were a whirlwind of progress. I had managed to secure the company's future, at least for the time being, and the team was finally starting to believe in the direction I was taking. The artists were back on track, new projects were being developed, and the once dismal financials were showing signs of recovery. But as much as I wanted to focus on the success of the business, a deep unease lingered. I had poured everything into rebuilding this company, and yet, the emptiness I felt at the end of the day was unshakable. No amount of work or achievement seemed to fill the void left by James. I kept telling myself that I had made the right decision, that leaving him had been the best thing for me, for my son. But there were moments, when the office was quiet and the world outside seemed far away, when I would find myself questioning everything. What if I had been wrong? What if, despite all the pain, James had been the one I was supposed to be with? The thought was absurd, but it lingered, like a ghost that wouldn't leave me in peace. One evening, after a long day at the office, I found myself standing in front of the window in my new home, watching the city lights flicker below. It was a beautiful view, one that I had worked hard for, and yet, it didn't feel like mine. I had worked so hard to prove to myself that I was capable of living without him, without his love. But deep down, I still longed for the family I thought we could have had. The sound of the doorbell pulled me from my thoughts, and I walked to the door, my heart skipping a beat when I saw who was standing on the other side. James. I froze, my mind racing. What was he doing here? He had no right to come to my house. After everything, I had made it clear that I never wanted to see him again. Yet, here he was, standing on my doorstep, looking weary and lost. James, I said, my voice guarded. What are you doing here? He looked at me, his eyes filled with pain and regret. I had to see you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know you don't want to see me, but I couldn't stay away. I needed to apologize, Evelyn. For everything. I felt a rush of anger and frustration rise in me, but I swallowed it down. You've already apologized, James. 1,000 times. And it doesn't anything. It doesn't change the fact that you walked away from me. It doesn't change the fact that you chose Vivian over me. He lowered his head, his shoulders sagging with guilt. I know I made a terrible mistake, Evelyn. I know I hurt you, and I can never take that back. But I need you to know something I should have told you a long time ago. I crossed my arms, unwilling to let him in. And what's that? James looked up at me, his eyes pleading. I never stopped loving you, Evelyn. Not for a second. And I regret everything I did, leaving you, abandoning our family. I was an idiot. I was so caught up in my own selfish desires that I didn't see what was right in front of me. But I know now. I see it now. You and Ethan. You're the only things that matter to me. The words hit me like a slap. He was trying to manipulate me again. He was trying to win me back with guilt-and deep promises he had already broken. And yet, despite my anger, my heart ached at his words. How could he still say that he loved me after everything? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my emotions. James, you don't get to do this. You don't get to come here and tell me that you love me now. You don't get to expect me to drop everything and fall back into your arms. You hurt me. You broke me. And I've spent all this time rebuilding myself. I won't let you destroy that. He reached out, his hand trembling. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want to try, Evelyn. I want to be there for you. I want to be there for Ethan. Please, give me a chance to make things right. I shook my head, stepping back from the door. I've given you so many chances, James. And every time, you've failed me. You don't get to have another chance. Not with me. Not with Ethan. There was a long silence between us, the weight of his words and my refusal hanging in the air. James stood there, his expression pained, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for him. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice breaking. I'll leave. But please, know that I'm always going to love you. And I'll never stop fighting for you, no matter what. With those words, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, my heart torn in two. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to scream, to run after him and beg him to stay, to fix everything that had broken between us. But another part of me knew that I had to let him go. Letting James go was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was the only way I could move forward. I had spent so much of my life trying to fix him, to make him the man I thought he could be. But in the end, he wasn't the man I needed. He wasn't the man I deserved. And so, I focused on my son, on my work, on building the life I had always dreamed of. It wasn't easy. There were days when I wanted to collapse under the weight of it all. But I knew that I couldn't give up. I had to keep going, for Ethan's sake. Vivian and James might have torn apart everything I thought I knew about love, but they couldn't take away the one thing that mattered, my strength. The weeks that followed James's visit were some of the hardest of my life. I couldn't escape the memory of his words, the desperation in his voice, the way he had pleaded with me as if he were still the man I once loved. But the truth was, he wasn't that man anymore. And I wasn't the woman who would let him back into her life. I threw myself into work. Every day was a blur of meetings, emails, phone calls. Evelyn Media was starting to stabilize, but the journey was far from over. We still had so many battles to fight. Investors were hesitant, the press was relentless, and Vivian's shadow still loomed over everything. But I was determined. I wasn't going to let the company fall apart again. I wasn't going to let James's mistakes ruin what I had worked so hard for. At night, when the house was quiet and Ethan was asleep in his crib, the silence was unbearable. I would sit by the window, staring out at the city lights, wondering what James was doing. Was he still with Vivian? Was he still sick? The questions haunted me, gnawing at my thoughts, even though I tried to push them away. I had convinced myself that I didn't care about James anymore. I had built a life for myself and my son, and that was all that mattered. But deep down, a small part of me still felt the pull. The memories of the good times, the love we once shared, still lingered in the corners of my heart, no matter how much I tried to bury them. One evening, as I was wrapping up a long day at the office, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it made my heart race. I hesitated before answering, a sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. "Hello?" I said, my voice tentative. "Evelyn?" The voice on the other end was shaky, almost unrecognizable. "It's Sophie. You need to come to the hospital. It's James, he's been diagnosed with cancer." The words hit me like a freight train. Cancer. The man who had once been my world, the father of my child, was sick. Really sick. I felt my heart tighten in my chest. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite all the pain and betrayal, I couldn't ignore the fear in Sophie's voice. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's in the late stages," Sophie continued, her voice cracking. "The doctors don't know how much time he has left. He's asking for you. Please, Evelyn. He doesn't have anyone else." I felt a chill run through me. James was dying, and he was asking for me. The man who had walked out on me, who had chosen Vivian over me, now needed me. I didn't know what to feel. Anger, sorrow, pity? But I couldn't deny the knot that formed in my stomach. "I'll be there," I said, my voice steady, but inside, I was a mess. When I arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of disinfectant hit me, and for a moment, I stood frozen in the hallway, unsure of what I was about to walk into. Sophie had given me the details, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I entered James's room. He looked nothing like the man I once knew. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and almost translucent. His hair, once thick and dark, was now thinning and brittle. He was hooked up to an 4, his body frail and weak. The vibrant energy that had once filled the room seemed to have disappeared, replaced by an overwhelming silence. James looked up when he heard the door open, and his eyes widened in surprise. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You came." I stood at the door, unsure of how to proceed. The emotions that had been buried deep inside me for so long threatened to rise to the surface. Anger, resentment, even a trace of affection. But I held it all back, forcing myself to stay calm. "How are you feeling?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. James smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not doing well," he said softly. "The doctors say I don't have much time left. Maybe a few months." The words sent a shiver through me. James, the man who had once been so full of life, was now staring death in the face. I took a step into the room, keeping a careful distance. "What do you need, James?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with regret. "I need you, Evelyn. I need your forgiveness. I need to make things right. I've wasted so much time, and now it's too late." I felt a surge of emotions rising inside me: anger, sadness, confusion. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much he had hurt me, how much he had taken from me. But instead, I remained silent, my fists clenched at my sides. "You didn't waste time, James," I said finally, my voice softer than I wanted it to be. "You made your choices, and I made mine. You can't expect me to just forget everything. You can't expect me to pretend that everything is okay." He looked down, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his guilt. "I know," he whispered. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I should have never let you go. I should have fought for us." I swallowed hard, fightin'. Back the tears that threatened to fall. "James," I said, my voice breaking, "you never fought for us. You left me when I needed you the most. You chose Vivian over me. And now, here you are, asking for my forgiveness? You can't have it. I can't give it to you." James's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in a long while, I saw the man I had once loved, the man who had been my partner, my confidant. But it was too late. He was already too far gone, and there was nothing left for us to salvage. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." I turned and walked toward the door, my heart heavy with sorrow and relief. I couldn't save him. I couldn't fix him. All I could do was walk away. As I stepped into the hallway, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle on my shoulders. James was dying, but I wasn't going to let his death destroy me. I had to let him go. I had to finally let go of the man who had once been my everything. I had to move on, for myself. For Ethan. The next few weeks were a blur. I found myself haunted by the memory of James, lying there in that sterile hospital room, his frail body clinging to life. His words echoed in my mind, his desperate apologies still ringing in my ears. But despite the weight of the past, I knew I couldn't carry it with me anymore. I had made the right decision to walk away. I had closed that door, finally and fully, and now I had to focus on what truly mattered: my son, my future, and the life I was building for myself. The days were filled with work, more meetings, more projects, more late nights. Evelyn Media was slowly, but surely, coming back to life. The artists were thriving, the finances were stabilizing, and the company's reputation was starting to improve. We were finally gaining ground after everything that had gone wrong. But even in the midst of success, there were days when I felt the emptiness creep back in. The house felt too quiet, too empty. Ethan was growing, his little smile lighting up my world, but there was still a part of me that missed the family I had once imagined we would be. The dream of a happy home, a loving husband, a secure future, seemed so distant now. It wasn't that I regretted my decision, no, I was proud of what I had achieved. But the pain of James's betrayal was still there, buried beneath the surface, ready to surface whenever I allowed myself to pause long enough to acknowledge it. One evening, as I sat in my office, reviewing some new contracts, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, already exhausted by the constant barrage of calls and demands. But something about this number made me pick up. "Hello?" I said, my voice a little more tired than I intended. "Evelyn?" The voice on the other end was familiar. It was Sophie again. "I'm sorry to bother you, but there's been some news about James. He's gone." The words hit me like a slap. Gone? I repeated, trying to process what she was saying. What do you mean? When? Just today, Sophie said, her voice trembling. He passed away early this morning. He didn't make it. The doctors tried everything, but it was too late. I sat there in stunned silence, my thoughts racing. James was gone. For a brief moment, I couldn't understand it. How could it be over? How could the man who had once been my world, the man who had been a part of my every thought, every dream, just be gone? But then I remembered. I remembered everything he had done. The lies. The betrayal. The way he had walked away from me, from our family, from the life we had once dreamed of. And suddenly, the weight of the news didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a final chapter had been closed. I see, I said quietly, my voice devoid of emotion. Thank you for letting me know. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, allowing the reality of it to sink in. James was gone. Vivian was gone. And I was still here, still standing, still moving forward. There was no room for regret, no room for second-guessing. I had made my choice. I had taken control of my life, of my future, and nothing, not even James's death, could change that. The days that followed were filled with a strange sense of calm. I didn't mourn James the way I thought I would. There was no wave of grief, no desperate longing for what could have been. I had already mourned him in my own way, long before his death. I had mourned the man I had once loved, the family we could have been, the life I had imagined. And now, there was nothing left to mourn. Instead, I focused on my son. Ethan was growing so fast, his laughter filling the house with light. He was everything I needed and more. I poured all my love and energy into him, knowing that I had everything I needed right here. I didn't need James. I didn't need anyone to complete me. I was enough on my own. Business continued to grow. Evelyn Media was gaining more and more recognition, and investors were starting to take notice again. The artists who had left Vivian Media were now thriving under my management, and the company was finally on a path to success once more. The scars of the past were still there, but they didn't define me anymore. I had learned to rise above them, to build something greater than the wreckage that had once been my life. And then, one day, as I sat at my desk, reviewing some new contracts, a thought crossed my mind, a thought that had never occurred to me before. I didn't need to be tied to this company forever. I had spent so many years building something for others. But now, it was time for me to build something for myself. I could feel it deep within me, a calling to do something more, something that truly mattered. I had always been passionate about helping others, about making a difference in the world. And now, I had the means, the freedom, and the strength to do just that. The idea began to take shape. A new business venture, one that would allow me to use my skills and resources to help others, to provide opportunities for people who had been overlooked or underestimated. It was a way to give back, to help those who had never had a chance to succeed. I spent weeks developing the idea, reaching out to potential partners, and laying the groundwork for what would become my next big project. It wasn't about the money, it wasn't about the fame. It was about making a real impact, about creating something that would leave a legacy that would outlast everything that had come before. And as I sat there, at my desk, surrounded by contracts, by plans, by dreams, I realized something. The past had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. I had let go of the man who had broken me, and in doing so, I had found my strength. The future was mine.